The goal of spirituality is to undo the problems that this thinker-self model identification creates. So that's to reduce identification with the thinker I, me, my. So I'm not really I, me, my, there's something else to me. Diminish the thinker's selfishness and self-centeredness, get more into the doer's pro-social goals, and reduce the thinker's judgments and criticisms. In particular, make the thinker more pro-social, love one another, to practice the spiritual virtues instead of the vices. Now, theistic spirituality also asks the thinker to surrender to God. In a preview, we will see that God is really the experiencer. So let's look at the non-theistic spiritual traditions first. When the thinker first became conscious, this increase in suffering could have been noticed by the experiencer and would have been more apparent. And these traditions are trying to undo that increase in suffering that was noticed that when the thinker became the conscious agent, the one that we think we are. We think we are the thinker. Now, some of these paths also have enlightened states, and in that state, the thinker's suffering can be completely undone, because that little box that says human self-model equals thinker self-model has been changed to human self-model equals experiencer self-model. So we aren't the thinker at all anymore. So the thinker is not going to affect the way that we experience world. In that state, there's no identification with the thinker. Now, continuing on with the theistic spiritual traditions, what is God in this model? Well, again, when the thinker first became conscious, a weaker thinker could have experienced a stronger agent with more power in the world than it had. In particular, the doer could have made the human do things that the thinker didn't think they should do. So that could be, me feeling like, hey, there's somebody more powerful than me controlling me. Thus, the doer or experiencer could have become identified as God to this early thinker. And the experiencer is actually the best candidate for God, because remember, the experiencer creates the world where the thinker self-models lives. That includes not only the sensory world model, but also the conceptual world model. Those are all created and contained inside the experiencer, and the experiencer is presenting that model. That world that the experiencer creates is the world that the thinker lives in. He lives in that world. Further, intuition comes from the experiencer, and intuition is often said to be the channel that God uses to answer prayer. And intuition comes from the experiencer, and a lot of religious paths talk about intuition as being God's conduit to us. And finally, I believe that the experiencer can be even more help to humans by modifying its attention mechanism. For example, someone who's trying to stop smoking cigarettes. Would it be a good thing for you if your experiencer just paid less attention to cigarettes? Like when you see a cigarette, you don't think about it. Or when you think about smoking, if the experiencer doesn't pay attention to that thought and it doesn't get amplified, wouldn't that be a useful thing? So this is something I think can happen with the experiencer. It can be useful to us to help us change the world and change the way that we live in the world. Now, almost all spiritual traditions use meditation of one form or another, and I won't go into all the individual kinds of meditation here, but they all are attempts to quiet the thinker's inner voice. And if we can quiet the thinker's inner voice, we can get in touch with the fact that we're more than just the thinker. We're that doer and that experiencer at the same time. Especially bottom-up meditation that pay attention to experiences that come to the attention, that's noticing the experiencer doing its bottom-up attention mechanism. And so all this makes it easier to notice that the doer and thinker are other agents, and to reduce the identification of the thinker. We won't think that we're just the thinker if we get into a good meditation practice. Now, how do other spiritual practices help solve the thinker problem? Well, surrender is the thinker giving up his illusion of control. Remember, he only has an illusion. He thinks he does everything, but he doesn't. So if he gives up that illusion of control, that's surrender. And the thinker can use prayer to ask for help from the doer and experiencer. Living in the now is what the experiencer does always. It's always living in the now. But the thinker is often off in the past or future, so if you can get into living in the now, you can get out of the thinker and into the experiencer. Forgiveness and acceptance can mitigate resentments caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the past. My favorite saying about forgiveness is that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. So as long as the thinker is trying to solve that problem in the past that happened, it's going to hold on to that resentment. If you can give up all hope of trying to solve that problem in the past and accepting exactly the way it is, that's when I can let go of resentment, and I can forgive the person that hurt me. Now, Krishnamurti was asked, what's your secret? Krishnamurti was supposedly an enlightened person, and somebody asked him, what's your secret? His answer was, you see, I don't mind what happens. And that's exactly what the experiencer does. The experiencer doesn't mind what happens. It doesn't mind what happens in the physical world here. It just records it and builds up the model it has in the world to duplicate whatever actually did happen in the world. It also doesn't mind what happens in the conceptual world. It doesn't feel threatened by any complaint or criticism. It just accepts that information in. It tries to incorporate it into the conceptual model of the world. If it can incorporate it into the conceptual model of the world, that means it understands it and takes that information in. If it can't incorporate it, if it's nonsense, it just ignores it because it's just nonsense. So if it can make sense out of it and make it and incorporate it into the model of the world, it does. If it can't, it just ignores it. But it's not minding about what happens. It's not complaining or anything like that. Trusting in a higher power can also help mitigate fear caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the future. If I can just trust that everything's going to be okay, I won't have to live in fear. And finally, gratitude is the antidote to the thinker's many complaints. If we can live in a world of gratitude, that's quieting down those thinker's complaints that he comes up with all the time. Now, another question is, can this model explain some Bible passages? And I think it can. For example, in Genesis, God brought all the animals and birds to Adam so he could name them. This is the experiencer allowing the thinker to generate nouns. In Eden, when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this is describing when we began to live in that conceptual world, back in that behavioral modernity time. This is when the human self-model became equal to the thinker self-model. So until that time, we were living in paradise, and that's what Eden is usually described as. There were no suffering, everything was beautiful, we got along with everybody, we were living in paradise. Then we took the bite of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's exactly what the thinker decides. This is good, this is bad, this should happen, this shouldn't happen. When we started living in that world of the thinker, that's when we started suffering. That's when we were cast out of Eden. That's when we had to wear clothes and all the other things they claim, that all the other suffering that we got. And finally, Jesus said, the Father and I are one. This could mean that his thinker has surrendered to the doer and or experiencer, or it could mean that Jesus was living in that experiencer enlightened state, and one of those two things.
There's also, I think, a wise intuitive modification of the attention mechanism that the experiencer can come up with, and that gives the experiencer, God, quite a bit more power over the world. And I'll talk about that by looking at alcohol addiction. The thinker starts the alcohol cycle going, and then the doer picks up that goal, and they both become addicted to alcohol. And the doer gets triggered if there's bottom-up attention. If somebody puts a drink in front of the alcoholic, he's going to pick it up and drink it without even thinking about it. That's the doer. And the thinker will obsess about alcohol. Boy, I'm feeling terrible. I'd feel better if I had a drink. Blah, blah, blah. And eventually, the thinker notices that there are a lot of negative consequences of drinking, and it wants to stop, but it's too late. The doer and both agents' goals are too strong. Thus, addiction is using both top-down attention and bottom-up attention focused on alcohol to keep the addiction process going. Let's look at AA, a theistic spiritual tradition that solves this alcoholic problem. They claim that to get a spiritual awakening from working the 12 steps, and I'm going to translate the first 3 steps into this language. So step 1 is the thinker wants to stop drinking, but admits it's powerless over alcohol and can't manage his own life. Step 2 is the thinker sees that the experiencer could help with the addiction. And step 3, the thinker surrenders to and asks for help from the experiencer. You go on and do the rest of the steps, and you make amends, and you look at your character defects, and you use prayer and meditation, and you get a spiritual awakening, and you no longer need to drink. Now, in the normal alcoholic, before the alcoholic gets into recovery, the normal attention control mechanism, like I said before, the bottom-up attention can cause the doer to drink alcohol, and the experiencer is also paying attention to the thinker's thoughts. So when the thinker is thinking about alcohol and, gee, I wish I had a drink, when the experiencer pays attention to that, that amplifies the thought. Just like the experiencer paying attention to an object in the world amplifies that object, paying attention to that thought amplifies the thought. So that makes that thought more powerful, and it makes it irresistible, and then the thinker ends up going out and drinking. So in the active alcoholic, that inner thought obsessing gets reinforced, and so it continues. Now, how can the wise intuitive intention mechanism fix this? Well, if the experiencer notices that the thinker admits it is defeated by alcohol, and that if it wants the experiencer's help to stop drinking, the experiencer says, oh, if I paid less attention to alcohol, that would help both the thinker and the doer. And so the experiencer makes this wise intuitive decision to attend less to thoughts about alcohol, both top-down attention and bottom-up attention to alcohol, and also attend less to the thoughts of the thinker when it's obsessing about drinking. So don't amplify those thoughts as much. And if the experiencer is doing this, that can cure the alcohol problem. This also is the cure for a lot of other problems that spirituality talks about. For example, attachments and aversions are the cause of suffering in the Buddhist tradition, and you can pay less attention to attachments and aversions and get help with that. A lot of enlightened people also talk about having less emotions and less of an inner voice, especially a self-referential inner voice. Again, if you don't amplify that inner voice, you'll have less of those. And all of this happens if the experiencer notes these goal requests and notes its request for its help.